Welcome to our April 2021 year-long reading challenge teen book discussion. Today I am joined by three other teen librarians, and we are going to be talking about Noelle Stevenson's graphic novel, The Fire Never Goes Out. I do want to give my colleagues a second to introduce themselves. Laura, let's start with you. Go ahead.
Hi, I am Laura. I'm a teen librarian at the Central Branch of the Boston Public Library.
Awesome. Let's jump to Charlie.
I am Charlie. I'm the Youth Outreach Librarian for the Boston Public Library.
And Bree.
Hey, I'm Bree. I am the Teen Technology Specialist at Teen Central of the Boston Public Library.
And I'm Allie. I am the Children and Youth Librarian at the Brighton branch of the Boston Public Library. And we are excited to talk to you all today about this graphic memoir. Just so you know, we are going to be discussing some of the mental illness that our author, Noelle Stevenson, experiences in the book. So if you find that's something that you know triggers you, we do maybe recommend you take a step back from the presentation, at least for the beginning, while we're talking more heavily about that. As a note, Noelle, our author, does use all pronouns and identifies as trans, masc, and bi-gender. So we may be switching in and out of pronouns throughout the talk today, but we'll do our best to make sure that you know who we're still talking about the whole time, so it's not super confusing. All right. And with that, let's go ahead and bring up our first slide. Chris is behind the scenes with us today, so he will be making those slides change. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is some of the themes of mental illness within the book, because it really informed the way that she created and her approach to creativity. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So would anybody like to jump right in? I know that I was the one that picked this first page. Chris, you can go ahead and switch it to the first comic. Great. So it should say, you see yourself as pretty harmless mostly. And it kind of goes from there. So we can talk pretty generally, I think, about this topic. Anybody like to start?
I think it was interesting how her journey with mental illness was tracked throughout the story, because she depicts it as this hole and this monster, and it really takes a long time for treatment to become an option or diagnosis to become an option. And that was definitely kind of tough to read while they were still figuring it out and coming to terms with it.
Yeah, I remember there being a panel we didn't end up including, but in the beginning, where Noelle tried to tell people in her life that she thought she was bipolar, and people were just like, no, you're not. No, you're not. And, her art, I think, reflects the way that battle was waging itself with her. So this panel I picked especially, so it says, you see yourself as pretty harmless mostly, but sometimes it's like a door opens in your chest and a thick black slime rushes out of you and covers your body, and it transforms you. And I think it was such just not graphic, but such a good way, and visually and word wise, to describe how she was feeling and how she would feel in those moments. And Chris, you can switch to the next page whenever you're ready. And this page has a picture of the monster that she draws, that she says lives inside her. Did any of you read her original work, Nimona? Could anybody speak to that? Because I know in that she's a shapeshifter, and she talks about how that kind of helped her express what she was feeling inside of herself when she was writing that as well.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I read it, but from what I recall, the character of Nimona is so she's a shapeshifter, but the way she shifts is into this monstrous thing, and she is sort of she's perceived, I think, by a lot of the other characters as being sort of this destructive, chaotic, potentially maleficent being, but the book is really focused on these two other characters who are trying to nurture her in a way, and I think that does speak very much to sort of what we read in this book about Noelle's own journey, and sort of interpreting what's her sort of transitions between like describing what's inside of her as a monster, and especially in this particular panel that you've chosen, Allie, where it's like there's a monster inside her that then sort of like she becomes and then goes back again. And I think it's interesting the way she talks about the like almost not recognizing herself in that form, but then seeing how seamless the transition between like this sort of evil, like as she perceives it, this like negativity, like how close that is to her own being, and whether that's who she truly is, or if she is the good person she thinks she is. Like, and I think that's something that is a really vivid, you know, a really vivid imagining of what like, you know, what she was going through internally.
Yeah.
And speaks to her creativity as a storyteller, I think, as well.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to flip to the next slide, I think this next panel really perfectly kind of captures it. It's a picture of Noelle looking into a mirror and the monsters looking back. And I just really loved this panel. Charlie had sent me an interview that Noelle did. Between the Sheets was the interview, and I got to hear a lot more of in their own voice of like what the experience was like writing Nimona and feeling this same way. And it's interesting to hear them talk about it and see the art that they were making at the time, because this is like a collection from across their life. And Charlie, I know you had brought up that interview, so is there anything specific about it you wanted to talk about as well?
In it, I mean, she talks about so many different personal issues that come up in this.
It was a
graphic
fantastic interview.
It was
So good.
Yeah, he does great interviews. Noelle, I was fascinated by because I had been following her on different social media accounts. I had been reading the blog posts that she was putting out these years in review. She's into role-playing games, so she hangs out with a lot of the online role-playing game community, as does Molly, their wife. And it was the first time that I'd heard them use the word bipolar disorder to describe their diagnosis. It was one of the things that was hedged around a bit in the blog posts, and obviously in this memoir. Is just they get a diagnosis, they're finally able to describe what they've been alluding to the entire time, and then they don't share it. And so it was interesting to me that after the book was published, they had this interview, and in that interview were willing to give their diagnosis out.
Yeah, I did find that interesting as well, that you're bringing up, like, we dance around it so much, but it's such like a big part of the book is the way that she's feeling when she's creating. And then when she gets the diagnosis, we as the reader don't know what it is. And until you sent me that interview, I didn't really know what it was. I knew what she thought it was, but I didn't know what her diagnosis was. So having that as like an external context was really helpful for me personally.
I want to give a quick shout out to the chat. Spooky Gaming says that they are reading Miss Peregrine right now. So that is not related directly to this book, but it is a book that has a lot of like creepy creatures in it. So check it out. Teen recommendation.
You probably like the way some of the stuff is drawn and depicted. Yeah, Nimona especially. All right, Chris, you can switch to the next slide. And something I also wanted to touch on. So this panel includes some text from Noelle in the memoir that says, "I was doing everything right. I thought I was working out, going to therapy, taking breaks. I had an incredibly kind and patient partner who was always there for me. I didn't understand why I couldn't just, through force of will, make myself okay." And whew, boy, that one really hit, didn't it, folks?
Yeah, I read that and I was like, that is such a familiar narrative, I feel like, amongst people who experience mental illness, to know that like you're like externally you're doing all the right things and you think that it should affect what's happening internally, and it just doesn't. And that's like the frustration of that is just like sometimes it never ends. Like even when you do, tackle the internal stuff as well, it's like a constant battle, and you think you're doing all the right things, and sometimes even all the right things like don't make you okay.
I think
Yeah.
one of the other things is just bipolar disorder is a lifelong mental illness. So by the time you get a diagnosis and you get treatment, it's lifelong treatment. If you have medication and you actually stay on it, it's a lifelong medication. It's a chronic condition.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that as an artist, she's looking for an arc and a like nice conclusion that she struggled with it and now it's resolved, instead of this is the rest of your life, and maintaining it is exhausting. So I definitely saw that come out.
I think that really ties in nicely to just how the blog posts were formatted in general, that idea of like looking for an arc, because it's not really till the later blog posts that you start to see Noelle admitting like things are not perfect, things are not great, I'm struggling. I felt like in a lot of the earlier posts, the art would depict the struggles, but then the kind of like year-end written wrap-up would be like, look at all these cool things that happened this year. And it felt like it wasn't really till the later 2010s that you started seeing the admission of like, we had ups and downs.
Yeah, Chris just popped in the chat that he said, it's that kind of like looking for a happy ending to your own story. And that feels like, yes, it's a reason I'm not a big memoir reader, because I'm always searching for that arc. And to bring up that interview that I watched from Charlie's recommendation, Noelle does talk a little bit about how they struggled with making those end of year posts sometimes, because it did feel a little bit like erasing all of the bad stuff that had like they went through to get there, and like just rounding up like all the great things that had happened to them. And I think as time went on, the year-end reviews did get a little more honest about how hard it had been to make it to the end of that year. I did want to end this kind of theme discussion on a happier note. So I wanted to show the panel. Chris, you can go ahead and switch. And this one has a picture of Noelle. She's older in this picture. So we follow in the book, we meet Noelle in 2011 in their blog posts, and we go all the way through 2019. And this one says, "You're not okay, but you will be. You are not done fighting yet, and you will see the sun again." And then right underneath it, it says, "I saw a psychiatrist and finally got a diagnosis I'd needed for a long time." And this drawing just kind of, I don't know, for me, it like really spoke to the sense of relief she got from getting the diagnosis, and it felt like being heard for the first time. So if you guys have that up and you want to comment on it, we've talked a little bit about it already.
It reminded me a lot. I don't know if the teens will get this reference, but it reminded me a lot of the show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And when the lead character finally gets her diagnosis, she has this whole song about how like she feels like finally everything's fixed because she couldn't put a name to it. And I think that's a very true to life feeling. And they just kind of connected in my head.
Yeah, I definitely thought of that too, Laura, because you recommended that show to me. But I think that it's, as Charlie was saying earlier, it is like this lifelong sort of, treatment and management, especially of bipolar disorder. And I think this panel really like acknowledges her, relief in being able to name the sort of monster or hole, or however they have imagined it throughout the narrative, and being able to identify it just makes it so much more of a manageable thing. It's like knowing the I don't want to say enemy, because obviously it's not, your disorder, like a disorder like this is not an enemy, but it's about knowing what you're struggling with, being able to identify it and name it, and being able to find the help that you need to keep moving forward in your life. You can really see the relief in this, and even like the image of like them, like walking. It's such a simple image, but it's like you have this sense of not exactly them leaving anything behind, but of just like continuation, rather than the sort of wrap-up narrative that we think of. So I appreciate that.
It's a pretty concrete image. I think it's one of the more concrete statements in the whole memoir. And it's interesting to me that she never really landed fully on a metaphor to try and describe what she was feeling, either with mania or with depression. Both of those kind of like mixed and blended through fire and slime and monsters and spikes in some parts. And yeah, for it just to land on a simple image of her as she is and just a concrete diagnosis after all of that wild imagery.
Yeah, I think there's a power in naming something a lot, like in knowing, but also because earlier in the book we'd seen Noelle try to tell the people in her life that she thought something was different and wrong, and she was not feeling like she was in possession of her own body. She spends a lot of time kind of focusing on that. And, in this moment, she gets it's such validation, I think, for her and her art and like what she was feeling. And I think that's really important. Also, as a side note, I love how in her art, she always makes sure to draw her little tattoos on her, which is just really cute and and also I love Noelle's tattoos in real life. So I really like that she took the time to like draw them on her little cartoon self. Great. Does anybody have any wrap-up points? Otherwise, we're going to move on into her creative endeavors, which, as we've discussed, were obviously informed by what she was like going through and how she was feeling mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically while she was creating art. No? Great. Creative endeavors. And you can pop right to the first slide, Chris. Charlie, this was a choice of yours. It's from the 2012 wrap-up, and it kind of depicts the kind of different styles of art Noelle was making at the time. So do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I brought it up from like a critical perspective.
Go for it.
Just because the graphic memoir is not structured in the way many graphic memoirs are. It's basically a copy-paste of every year in review. And the year in review was an annual report that she was sharing. I mean, it was with, she had patrons, she had people that were buying her fan art, and they were coming to her blog to see that, find her website, get prints. So it made sense to me that, like, in it, she's listing off all of her accomplishments. She's sprinkling in a little bit of her personal life. She's sharing some of her fan art. But it does make the book itself feel a little bit disorganized or not as cohesive as far as intent. We were just talking about the really deep emotional narrative that kind of comes throughout, but it's tamped down beginning and end every single time with a list of her professional accomplishments and an address to her fans and the people that are spending money on her art. And I think that pressure really comes through in the earlier years where she is just sharing her sketchbook and all of the art she's been coming out with, some of her most popular pieces that sold really well. And so promoting work like Nimona, promoting some of the fan art that she was doing. I can't zoom in to the bottom.
Oh, I can.
Panel.
What would you like me to read?
So I know that like she did a lot of Avengers.
Fan art.
That was really popular. Yeah, and it's paired with these like beautiful watercolor paintings that show up later on in the graphic memoir, and then the panels that she does just of herself and her own experiences are completely, I guess I was trying to juxtapose some of the different artistic styles that she uses. Because the most consistent narrative voice that she has is actually in her text and not in her panels.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to flip to the next slide, there's like an example of some of the other art that Noelle was making at the time as well.
I did definitely wonder as I was reading this what it would be like coming into this book as someone that didn't have any familiarity with her prior work or things that they've done before, because like Charlie said, it can feel a little bit like you're jumping around a lot. And I felt like having some connection to, I know Nimona, I know Lumberjanes, I know She-Ra, that gave me like a steady place to kind of come into it from. So I don't know.
Yeah, I appreciated. Oh,
no, go ahead, Brie.
Charlie, I appreciate that you do point out sort of the versatility. I think in Noelle's artwork, and it's interesting how much they do sort of show that by just having like, you know, like this sketch here and this like, you know, much more polished, you know, rendered piece here and things like that. And I agree, Laura, that if I didn't know a lot of their work beforehand, it would have like even reading it, knowing all of that, and sort of trying to follow the narrative that they kind of are creating with these year in reviews, it still felt a bit disjointed. But I think I think it really speaks to, you know, the process, like their process, right, of and their versatility as an artist too, to sort of show, you know, what they were going through, what, you know, art they were creating at the time, and the range of that I think was really interesting.
Yeah, so I only knew Noelle from the like fan art that I was like really thrilled to see some of that fan art, because I was like, oh my god, I do remember seeing that it like on Tumblr during the height of like some of these fandoms. Like Chris, I don't know if it's possible for you to go back a slide. Cool. So the panel that has at the bottom, you can see it's Katniss and Peeta from the Hunger Games. And I so vividly remember this post coming across my dash. And it's, hey, Mitch, stop. Peeta is gravely injured. And the little parachute says, make out. And then the second little parachute says, use tongues. And Katniss is saying, oh, nice, hey, Mitch. God, go away. And I just remember like being like, that is exactly what that felt like. I, you know, the more of her art that she was sharing in the book, I was like, oh my god, yeah, like I definitely have seen that art, but I didn't really know anything about Noelle. Like I didn't really know Nimona. I didn't know their like other work, and it wasn't until I was reading the book that I realized that she was the creator of She-Ra, which she like barely, because we only have the year ends, we don't really get into the like that show and process, which I think would have been kind of interesting. But I was glad that when Charlie said that they wanted to talk about she wanted to talk about how Noelle's blog versus the book kind of went, because for me, I had no context for these posts, so it felt extremely disjointed. And because I already wanted an arc because of who I am as a reader, it was even harder because I had no context for anything. So I will say that was really hard as someone who did not know anything about Noelle before starting this book.
Also, just a shout out to Tumblr for like, I think I remember.
We need to shout out that hell site.
Well, no, I thanks, Allie. No, I'm just like, as a medium, it like, I think it. Like I can't think of another platform that Noelle could have done this on.
Oh, that's for sure.
That's yeah. But I like, I mean, not to like shout it out as a platform that everyone should go back to, but just like appreciating appreciating this, like the structure she was able to do because of that. And I think like fan art is a big thing on that platform as well. But also to for me to be reading it and thinking about what I was doing at the time and remembering getting into Tumblr and being like, oh, this was like at the height, and then like towards the end, I'm like, I don't know how much she was using it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the only context I really had was the general, like, being on Tumblr in those years, which I will say, I say hell site very fondly. Like,
oh, yes.
Oh, every day of my life. We used to get around those, like, school, like, firewalls so you could go on Tumblr during class. Obviously.
God. Oh, right, because you were in
Oh, right. The running joke is that I'm like one of the youngest ones. So yes, I was in school. But I will say I did really appreciate getting to know the artist behind a lot of that stuff, because it was so like not formative, but like it was such a gateway into like more fandom for me, and like a new way to interact with fandom, especially the Avengers stuff. I remember she used to do a lot of like Clint Natasha stuff, and they were always so funny. And I loved it. And also she did a lot of like Hawkeye and the Hulk, which she does bring up in the book. Also hilarious. She was so funny, and her art was like so good at capturing just like that like deadpan humor. And so it was cool to see the other stuff that same artist went on to do. Like she like created and ran She-Ra, like in the Princesses of Power. Great. Chris, if you want to skip the next slide that we already saw and then go to the next one, we can talk a little bit about her creative fire and what drove her to be so prolific at such a young age. We have this one: the fire never goes out. Sometimes it keeps you warm. Sometimes it makes your blood run cold. And I always think it's important to mention the passages of the book that are the title of the book, because they hold like a special, like more special meaning. So Laura, I know you've brought up the imagery of fire and the hole before. Do you want to speak a little bit about this panel, because it was your selection?
Yeah. Well, like you said, I think just when the title is referenced in a graphic novel in particular, that's important. But it definitely was kind of stressful reading some of this about this fire pushing her to get all the success at such a young age, and all her fears that she wouldn't accomplish anything else. And I feel like reading it as an older person, you can kind of feel like, oh my gosh, this person accomplished so much at such a young age, and like I didn't enter this career that I'm in until I was 29. So I kind of wanted to include this stuff just to be able to talk about the fact that, like, if your life is not like this, that is okay. And that does not mean that you're not going to be successful, but also just the idea of burnout in particular, he talks about a lot. And that was very real, particularly in this year that we are in.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a little bit too. We're going to jump into that. But yeah, I think... And Noelle does speak. I think we're going to hit it again a little bit later in a panel that both Charlie and I wanted to include, about this idea that if you don't accomplish these things when you're young, what is it worth? Like, what is your life worth? And that's an insane concept. Age does not dictate your creativity or what you're capable of being successful. Many, many people did not get their start till later, but I think Noelle touches on something that's so prevalent in our like society, which is that from a very young age, it's like, I want to make it big and I want to be really young when I do it. And then it's kind of like, where do you go from here? What do you do? Chris, if you want to jump to the next slide. 2018 in review. So Charlie, this was part of the selection of panels you had sent me. Do you want to talk a little bit about what made you pick this one?
I picked this one in thinking I was also looking for some kind of a through line, trying to erase all of what I already knew about her. And the constant references to fire are a reminder to me that one of the big metaphors used for bipolar disorder most often is fire, a flame. One of the seminal texts on bipolar disorder in artists specifically is called Touched with Fire. So seeing her constantly using the metaphor of a flame and seeing the way that she had all these incredible accomplishments early on, it made a lot of sense to me that she was experiencing burnout, but it was obscuring for her a lot of the cyclical symptoms I assume she was probably facing. And so I feel like everyone now has that burnout culture of there's always more that I can do. There's always more that I can be. I can always be better. And if I'm not doing anything, then I'm not useful and I don't belong here. And to compound that then with these incredible highs and lows, I feel like a lot of that ended up coming up again and again in the 2018 year in review. And that was really when it all came to a head for her. So that's why I pulled that panel up, is I felt like that metaphor was finally complete.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to go to the next slide, Noelle genuinely does perfectly, I think, illustrate what burnout feels like and the ways that we justify experiencing burnout to ourselves. So the slide reads, okay, maybe you are burning out. Maybe that's okay. I'll rise from the ashes like a phoenix and I'll be way hotter. Like, it's such a justification of like why it's okay to make yourself feel that bad. And you know what, Noelle? I didn't need this kind of call out on my Thursday afternoon. Like, I'm good. But yeah, I think it was a really good illustration and almost putting into words, I think, the way burnout culture is embedded in our psyche and in our workflow.
And I think also just the way that mental illness can play into leading to these burnouts that they have, and kind of talking about how Charlie talks about artists and bipolar in particular, there can be this stereotype of like, don't get treatment because if you get treatment, you're going to lose your creativity. And Noelle touches on that a bit at the end, that getting treatment didn't take away their creativity. It made it so that these burnouts weren't as fast and hard and intense so that they could keep actually getting stuff done.
Yeah, I thought that was really I appreciated that as well, because I think he specifically says that he's afraid of taking medication because that will, like hinder his creativity somehow. And I, there is there are a lot of artists that are known to have had bipolar disorder in particular, and I think there's, it goes along with that expectation, right? Of, if you are creative, you have to always be creating, you always have to be producing. And that's, that's what ends up leading to burnout. And as Charlie was saying, that sort of cyclical nature of just like pushing yourself too hard and then burning out and crashing, and these highs and lows. And I appreciate Noelle being able to talk about, that once they did get on the medication and get the treatment that they needed, that it did not hinder their creativity. It just made them able to sort of focus better and like hone what they were doing. And, just like with potentially his emotional state, being able to balance it out to a degree so that so he wasn't constantly just burning out every time.
Yeah, there was something on the internet I read like years ago, and it really changed my perspective on when it comes to like the intersection of mental illness and creativity. And it was something along the lines of like, it was like, well, if Van Gogh had antidepressants, we wouldn't have his art. And someone just made the point, but Van Gogh might still be alive, like might have lived a long and happy life. And like, art at what cost, And we study all these typically white men in like our lit classes and all this of like Hemingway and all of them, and they all had they all had deeply affected mental states or undiagnosed because they didn't know about them at the time, mental illnesses. And we don't talk about the ways that really took tolls on their relationships and their lives and their like personal, like their own view of themselves. But then we like look at their works and they're revered, and it perpetuates this cycle of like, you have to feel bad to make good art. And I loved that Noelle was like, that's crap. Like, you can feel good and make good art. And I really loved that she brought that up, and she like was so reassuring to the readers of both her blog and this book that medication did not hinder her ability to still do and create the way that she loved. And Chris, you can switch to the next slide where we're still getting some of those images of the fire. So I wanted to share the end of this slide, the text. It reads, "It made me feel like I was living my life in a perpetual state of fight or flight, usually fight. At first, my fierce and stubborn temperament was a benefit in the environment I was in. It was clear to me that showing weakness, even for a moment, would be the end, but it was hard to know when to stop fighting, and fighting takes its toll." And I just thought that played into this burnout that she was feeling so well. and that we all kind of feel, because she wasn't just like battling her own feelings. She was also battling this like external world that put expectations on her and what she was creating. So the fire keeps you warm, but it also eats you alive. All right, Chris, you can swipe to the next slide, because this is one both Charlie and I selected. So Charlie, if you want to talk about it a little bit first, it's from the 2018 year in review still. It's the Everest comparison.
Yeah. Trying to watch it up on Twitch as well. It was another metaphor that I really appreciated. I'm trying to expand it so that I can really look at it. Some of it does, I think, about that burnout being a universal kind of feeling, but in a lot of what she describes, it's so sustained, and her accomplishments are so wildly out of the norm for people her age from the very beginning. And I know this is the 2018 year in review, but building up to that, all of the accomplishments, starting with getting a book deal right off the bat from a Tumblr, a couple of posts, to reaching new heights with her career. I don't know. The mountain is another metaphor, I think, for just, you're never going to get to the top. And even if you get to the top, there's going to be another mountain that you feel like you need to climb. And I think this, as things start to kind of fall apart towards the end of the book, as she becomes more raw and more honest about what she's going through, the arc gets a little bit more wobbly as well. Not many other thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I had picked this one for very similar reasons, but something that really also resonated with me and I think kind of summed up how Noelle was feeling at this point in their life was almost everyone who dies on the way down. The summit, as much as you want it, is only the halfway point. And that to me was like, her career, she had skyrocketed, like Charlie said, got a book deal off of her blog that she was really just doing for herself. Like, she wasn't doing it to get the attention of publishers. And then Shira and all these other projects that she worked on, Lumberjanes, and all these awards that she won, the Eisner, like 7 times or something, which is wild. How do you come down from that? How do you, you're constantly now chasing the next high, right? But every mountain has to be higher than the last one. And coming back down from that sounds really dangerous, but I think is extra dangerous for somebody who is already predispositioned to, experience those highs and lows in a very amplified way, and how much it can affect them and their own health and mental health. So I just really liked the idea that the summit is the halfway point, because we don't think about people like what happens after you have done the best thing you can do. What happens, I think about this actually all the time because I love to be sad and I love to think about things that will make me sad. But like in a healthy way, if you're my therapist and you're watching this, no, you're not. But Olympic gold medalists, like, what do you do next? Like, I have this thought about Simone Biles all the time. Like, not only is she like an Olympic gold medalist, she is literally the best one. Where does she go? How do you just return to normal life? And for gymnasts, they peak so young because you only compete until you're 22. What do you do after that? You've done this phenomenal, the whole world knew your name. And then what comes next? And I think Noelle perfectly captures that in this moment and how she's feeling.
Boston native Ashley Wagner talks about that on her Instagram a lot.
Cool.
Nice.
It reminds me of the opposite of the deep dive where you get the spins, is it called? It's like the opposite of that, where it's coming down is going to be just as difficult as coming back up. Another thing I'm thinking, looking at this, finally zoomed in, is that, I think we talk about hustle culture a little bit differently now, but when it first started to become a term that we use to hustle, to grind all the time, it was mostly used in like the tech industry.
Yeah.
And so for an artist to talk about hustling constantly and being in that mentality of like, I can do more, better, bigger, always, and to be that young and never be able to set reasonable expectations, anyone climbing that mountain is doing it of their own accord. And I think that was probably one of the struggles for her, is all of the goals she set for herself and far surpassed were the ones that she set for herself. And so, yeah, she was far surpassing her own expectations, and through that, I think, hurting herself a little bit too.
Yeah, it was like she was her own, like in a lot of ways, her own worst enemy in terms of like how fast and how well she was creating. Like, She-Ra was amazing. Like, I love that show. I watched it in like one sitting all the way through, would not shut up about how much I love Mermista. Like, and what do you do next? How do you do something bigger and better than that? And the answer sometimes is you don't have to. Like, everything doesn't have to be flashier than what you did next. Chris, if you go to the next slide, I took us back to the beginning in 2012, and this was another overlap of choices between Charlie and I. And this one is, in short, summer 2012 was incredible. I'd never lived in such a big city, she's talking about Los Angeles, before, with so much happening all the time. Everything that I could have hoped would come out of that summer did. So it was sad when at the end of the summer it was time to go home. The thought of going back to Baltimore and finishing my last year of school was a bit depressing, to be honest, and it really did feel like I was putting down roots in LA. This was everything that art school had prepared me for, after all, but in the end, I did go back. But I loved this idea that because when you graduate from college, or when you take your first step into like what you think you want your professional life to look like, it can be very different from what you've experienced so far. And in this moment, she was like, she had worked with people in her field, she had moved across the country away from her support group, and she felt in this moment that she really was doing what she loved to do. And I just, that was like a really positive portrayal of her creative journey.
Interesting to me because just from following a lot of comic book artists on like Twitter and Instagram, it feels like they are constantly debating whether or not you need to go to art school and whether or not art school is worth it. So it was interesting to see that Noelle seemed to not really enjoy art school, but also pretty strongly feel glad that he went.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciated that as well. And I think in shortly after this panel, after this page, he sort of talks about how graduation felt a little bit emptier because of that. Like it was still meaningful and important to him to graduate, but when it actually happened, it was like not as big of a step as actually being surrounded by like other professionals and being able to create in those spaces and make those connections. And I know a lot of people in the tech industry talk about this as well, because the tech field is definitely an area where, like you can go get a computer science degree, but by the time you graduate, the stuff you have learned is potentially outdated. And it's kind of more the being in the field, and artists too, like, Noelle as an illustrator and artist, and other artists that I have met are like, you can go to art school and that can be great. And in a sense, art school is sort of what propelled him to make this journey to go to LA and get the internship and all of that. So it's kind of that, it's a reminder, I think, to all of us that, school, like higher education in that sense, can be really valuable, but the sort of networking and connecting to other professionals is what really, launches you into your passion in a way that sometimes school doesn't. I really appreciated that.
I also think, and this came up in the interview, the Between the Sheets interview, but when I see this panel, I also think about the element of control that she relishes and the level of independence that she has being across the country from the family that she loves, but who she also has struggled with. And in that interview, post-graphic memoir, post-years in review, I learned that she was homeschooled up until going to high school. And that high school was another very uncomfortable transition for her. And she had the same kind of impatience of, she used to be in control of when she did her work and how often and how much and with who and in what environment. And if she was done with a test, she could leave and go on about her day instead of waiting for everyone else to finish. And so a lot of her experiences with high school were very just impatient and ready to be done and ready to move out and go to college and get more control. And college did not, like, it gave her a little more control and a little more independence, but getting that taste of it in moving to LA and then having to give it freely back and lose that control and lose that independence when she's like, oh, this is how I'm supposed to feel and supposed to be. And again, it felt kind of like that cycle, the burnout cycle that she was in and the bipolar cycle, and also just the cycle of, I want this independence, I want this support and this structure, and seeing those constantly clash.
Nice. All right, I am going to move us to our next section because we are really in this discussion, and I just looked at a clock. So we're going to talk a little bit about growing up and adulthood that Noelle experienced, and I think the independence that she found in Los Angeles is a really good example of the ways in which she experienced growing up and adulthood. But the first panel that we have here, Chris, let me know when it's up, is the most accurate depiction of having to be an adult when you don't want to I've ever seen. And so this panel is Noelle lying on the ground, and then also Noelle saying, hey, it's okay. And it says, you can do this, get up. And then we're an adult now and there's work to be done. And like, that is such a big part of burnout culture too, is this like adulthood culture, in that like you aren't allowed to have these moments of wanting to just like lay on your floor and do nothing because you're an adult with responsibilities and people count on you. And it feeds into that burnout culture and this idea that you always have to be doing things.
Is it controversial to say that's also a product of capitalism?
Is it controversial if it's true?
I mean, yeah, it's like being an adult is often about your productivity as well as your responsibilities, right? And if you're not being productive, then you're not being an adult. And that's not really fair. Like, your existence is not defined by, by what you're able to put out. And we talked about that too with the burnout culture as well, and with Noelle's, burnout with their creativity and how that can be a big issue and especially for artists in a capitalist economy, is like, if you aren't creating, then you're also not making a living. And the idea that sometimes we need to rest in between those spurts of productivity, that's real. We do.
Yeah.
We're humans first.
Spooky Gaming says in the chat that they don't want to be a grown-up. And I would just like to say, I also do not want to be a grown-up in the current definition and the societal expectations that are placed on the grown-ups. But if we could like reform the system, I do love being able to buy whatever I want with my money. Like, nobody can stop me from having ice cream for breakfast. That's rad. Only me.
That's pretty
and I know the guy in charge. She's also me. And she says you can have ice cream for breakfast. So like things like that are great. There are a lot of great things about adulthood, but we put a lot of barriers between being able to enjoy that independence and feeling like you're being crushed by that word Bree said earlier that I'm not going to say again, but it's capitalism.
I mean, expectations in general, just being crushed by general expectation.
Yes. So this is Noelle talking to their younger self, and they say, I miss being you sometimes. And Noelle from college from earlier says, me, I'm a mess. I'm hungry and lonely and cold all the time because the radiator doesn't work and I'm scared of the landlord and I never sleep. And then the adult version of Noelle says, yeah, I guess you'll miss that one day. You'll miss when the world could be anything and anywhere is better than here. And that's, we romanticize a little bit our younger selves and our younger lives. And I think for Noelle, that was especially poignant as things got harder, because when you look back at something, you find the order to it. And when you're experiencing something, you can't find that pattern.
This was like one of the few panels about kind of dealing with mental health and burnout and being an adult and stuff that I felt didn't resonate with me a ton, just because I feel like one of the great things about being an adult and in your like late 20s onward is you get to a point where you are like comfortable with who you are, you don't care what other people think, you're just like doing you and living your life. And even though maybe you're still dealing with like imposter syndrome or burnout or struggling with whatever mental health struggles you deal with, I just like I would not feel this. So I don't know. That was a different perspective on it.
I mean, yeah, you definitely could not pay me to go back to like other parts of my life. But I think for some people that's not true.
Yeah.
Like some people do want to go back to a time in their life that was easier, or where things seemed to make more sense, or they felt they had more control. I am going to move us. I'm going to have Chris go to the next slide, but you can
go ahead.
You can bring up your point.
I think this was one of the only panels where she's addressing her younger self, and she's not expressing like deep sympathy or empathy for what her younger self is going through, and is more like asking for sympathy for not being in that space anymore. And that was like this panel as well, is her kind of comforting her younger self of, it's not going to go away, but like it's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked the response in this panel of, no, I don't think so. Like, it's not scary anymore, I don't think. And Noelle had mentioned earlier in the graphic novel how because the hole had appeared, it had time to almost scar over. So the hole didn't hurt anymore. It was just there. And I think in this moment, it also helps older Noelle to, oh my God, I did a graduation flub. Who am I? The provost of Noelle's college?
How dare!
My God, I know. It doesn't help that my best friend's name is Nicole, so I'm just like, But I think no, I don't think so, because Noelle hasn't, figured everything out, this adult version of herself, but they've both been living with this, and it's a shared, spot of sympathy for them and empathy. All right, we're moving along. Sorry. Love and self-image. Let's roll. You know what, Chris? Skip the first one. Just go right to the second one. Great. Thanks. Awesome. So Noelle talks a little bit about having issues with seeing bodies, especially I think as an artist, you see a lot of not fantastically represented body types. And I think for somebody like Noelle, who at the time couldn't decide what hair length they wanted, didn't really, know how they want to present themselves to the world, they were really focused on that kind of image. But eventually they got to a really good place where that didn't necessarily matter. And this panel says, all those bodies fit together in infinitely fascinating ways. And the stuff I hated before, thighs and bellies and wrinkles and bulges, now they were the best part. I love this journey for her.
Both the previous one and then the journey that takes them to this point in the comic, I loved, because I think it speaks so well to it was a really, really good articulation, I think, of struggles that a lot of young women in particular, but I'm sure any gender has with sort of seeing what the image of women in media or even men in media, what that looks like, how they're portrayed, and what an ideal is, and being well, that doesn't look like me, so am I a real woman, am I a real man? And being able, the way that they then go from the way they get to this point of appreciating all of this variation is through life drawing classes. And as an artist, you know, like will see people of all body shapes and sizes and genders, come through, and you have to draw them, and being able to find appreciate the nuance and the variety and the beauty in everybody. I love how they articulate this.
The other
Yeah.
I thought was really important in the discussions about weight in this book was when Noelle was dealing with her first kind of major breakdown. She loses a lot of weight, and she's talking to an older friend and says, I think I'm bipolar. And the friend says, oh, I wish I had what you had. You look great. And then he goes home, and everyone at home is like, oh my God, you look great. You look so skinny. And I just really liked that be included, because I think that really highlights how you should not comment on people's bodies, because even if you're saying something that you think is a compliment, it can be really damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Soapbox.
Love that. No, good soapbox. I also think that this mindset that Noelle found themselves in about like finding, all of this stuff fascinating about bodies and the parts that she ended up loving best really comes through in She-Ra, and the way that the characters in She-Ra are like, they're all drawn differently and they move differently. And it was just like, it was such a gentle place to exist for a while. And yeah, like it's fighting and saving the world and bad things are happening. Yeah. But it was never mean to people for how they looked. And you know what? I could live in that world. I could fight some bad guys if it meant everyone would be quiet when I like put a new shirt on. Like, silence. Great job. So I like to see the way that Noelle's own journey with self-image translates into the art they then put into the world. It's rad.
Super rad.
Should we talk about love?
Ooh.
Chris, you can switch to the next slide. This is sad love. We'll get to the happy love later. So this is the time so again, this is maybe because I wasn't following the blog for the whole year, so maybe there was more conversation about this person. But Noelle describes a person that they loved as, this is what my love for you is like. You were nice to see from my airplane window, but I am safe here. I can't touch you, and if I tried, there'd be nothing there, just coldness, wetness. They're describing their love for somebody as a cloud, like a thing you think you can touch, but it's not actually fun to touch if you can do it. And that was really sad. And then if you skip to the next slide, Chris, we get to see Noelle with Molly, their wife, and the first time that they kind of decide that they're going to be together. I love Noelle and Molly. If you haven't seen the little
the Instagram pictures are
they're so cute. And also they did an interview with, maybe it was GQ recently, I don't remember, but they did an interview with them about what it's like for both of them to be working at home, and it's so cute, and they're so like cozy in their little house. Anyways, I love Molly and Noelle, and I think they're very cute together.
And they have beautiful pets.
Oh, gorgeous.
They play all those role-playing games together. They were Wendy Darling and Peter Pan together in one of them. It's very cute.
That's so cute.
They're adorable.
And then Chris, if you go to the next one, I think this is, so throughout the book, Noelle talks about not really being comfortable in their body a lot. And some of that, is symptomatic of the mental illness and bipolar disorder. When they're in depressive episodes, they feel disconnected from their entire person. But there's also this, not struggle, but this exploration of gender and gender presentation and sexuality that Noelle kind of goes through. And this is a picture that they drew of themselves in a wedding dress. And it says, "Don't laugh, okay? I haven't worn a dress in years. I know it looks dumb." And then you can go to the next one, because in this picture she looks a little sad, but in the next one, look how happy she looks with Molly in her little dress. And she looks like a fairy princess. She feels like a fairy princess. And I just think, for Noelle, it was less about what she was wearing and more about being able to wear whatever she wants with the person that she loves. And then to wrap up really quickly, the last quote on this panel is, "Maybe it's okay to want this after all." And that's the book. Any last thoughts?
Those are good last words.
I really
good,
wanted
though.
to end on like a really happy. Noelle and Molly are still happily married. They're having a good time. Also, I would just like to say, as somebody who also was, I guess I can't say it was that recent anymore, but like in the acknowledgments, Noelle writes to my wife, and then in parentheses, wife with a bunch of exclamation points. When I got married to my wife, I would do that constantly. I'd be like, oh, my wife, like legally speaking. So it was very relatable. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about upcoming events. We had a quick question to maybe go around quickly and say what our favorite book is. So start thinking now. You can only get one. You have 10 seconds to say it. And then we'll get out of here. So, all right, upcoming events. Laura, you have something cool going on?
May 13th, we will be hosting Brittany Morris, who's the author of Slay, which is like a video game thriller novel, and The Cost of Knowing, which is a new social justice sci-fi novel. She will be talking to teens, answering questions, and you can register for that at bpl.org/events. Charlie.
Next Tuesday at 3:30, we have another virtual live lab tour with the Hui Lab from Harvard T.H. Chan's Department of Metabolic Health. There are scientists there who will give a live half-hour tour. You can register on our website and ask the scientists questions as they're walking you through the lab, talking through their experiments. All of the tours are recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube.
Awesome. Bree?
So I want to plug Chris and I, Chris, who you know from other streams, and is in the background right now, work with two really great local teens. They have been working with us since September, and both of them are going to be running their own teen programs upcoming starting in May. One of them is going to be doing a program called Tech Tools for Digital Activism. She is the founder and leader of an organization called Girls Give Back, and she's going to go over this really cool tool to make videos to get your causes seen. It should be really fun. And then we also have our other teen tech mentor is going to be doing a teen game jam. So it'll be kind of a contest to create your own video game that touches on a issue or cause from your community or a global community. And the first event, the Tech Tools event is on May 13th. There is a Q&A session for the game jam that is on May 7th. And you can register for both of those on the BPL website as well.
Awesome. And the last one that we're going to plug today is if you like talking about books, Laura and I will be back tomorrow in a completely unmoderated format on our Instagram Live, where we'll be talking about what we're reading, what we're excited to have coming out in what month are we in? April, early May. And we'll be dissecting some of the hot goss in the young adult world. So stop on by our Instagram tomorrow at 3. Right? I'm going to roll up at 3, so I hope.
And our next month's book is Sarah Farzan, Here to Stay. Here to Stay. That will be May 20th.
Yep, we'll be back May 20th with the same kind of format. All right, and super fast, favorite book, Laura.
Are you going to say the fantasy book that we both just read?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Well, since Spooky Gaming asked this and they are reading Miss Peregrine right now, I'm going to recommend Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone. I feel like that has a very similar, like, fantastical, all sorts of wild creatures vibe. Really love that. Check it out.
All right, Charlie, favorite book?
Little Weirds by Jenny Slate.
Nice. Bree?
It has a weird title. It's called Sexing the Cherry by Jeanette Winterson.
Okay, and my current favorite is Legend Born by Tracy Dion, which I hope is what Laura was referencing when she... Okay, great. That book's great. Legend Board, 10 out of 10.
I have it on hold. It's waiting for me on hold. So
Excellent. It's so good. All right. We have been the Boston Public Library Teen Services team. Thank you so much. You can find out more information about the year-long reading challenge that this book discussion was a part of at bpl.org/yearlong. Sign up to track what you're reading and to check out what next month's recommendations are. And until May 20th, we have been Allie, Laura, Charlie, and Bree, and we will see you next time.